Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Mike Green of the United States Studies Center and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green, joined by a longtime friend, Michael Schiffer, who was former assistant administrator for the USAID, Agency for International Development, Bureau for Asia from 2022 to 2025, but with a really interesting, I didn't say checkered, interesting career that spans the full spectrum of what we do in strategy, including a really very important role as senior advisor and counselor to the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and a senior position in the Defense Department and with Senator Dianne Feinstein. So he's looked at Asia from the defense, development, and diplomacy perspectives. We're going to pick his brain about the consequences of the USAID dismantlement, what development means in strategy, and what the consequences are, and also what do we do next? What do we build? How do we work with friends and allies to try to bring back that piece of our toolkit? So, Michael, welcome. Always fun.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be here and good to see you.
Now, I always ask guests how they got here, and in your case, it's a particularly good question.
It's one I ask myself every day.
Am I right that you started out in peace studies, or is that just a rumor my brother Matt spread to get you in trouble? How'd you get into this?
I think that was a rumor that your brother Matt spread. I am still not entirely sure how I got into this, but I guess the easiest point of entry was I was thinking that I was going to be an academic doing political science and American politics in particular. And then I fell through a weird set of relationships into a fellowship in Senator Feinstein's office when I was finishing up my doctoral dissertation. She offered me a job. I decided that having a job was much easier than looking for a job. And so instead of going on the academic job market, I fell from the one true faith. Didn't take much temptation to get me to fall.
What was your academic work on?
So I was looking at presidential campaign promises from foreign policy, national security, and presidential performance in office, sort of doing a democratic theory critique. And it was coming out of some experiences I had working on presidential campaigns where I was, as a fresh college graduate, helping to generate some statements and promises that the presidential campaign, and I will leave aside which one it was making. And after the dust settled and we lost, I was sort of thinking to myself, so if we'd gotten elected and we had done this stuff, which was a half-assed, on-the-fly proposal that was ginned up by some completely undereducated recent college graduate, that would be bad for policy. On the other hand, if we didn't do it, then that's bad for democracy. And so trying to look at how you reconcile these things.
Well, I won't mention the administration either, but a senior Democratic national security figure in the Obama administration told me that in his experience, about half of campaign promises have to be jettisoned if you're going to have a reasonable foreign policy. He figured 50% went.
As surprisingly, actually, it's only about 25 or 30% that go. This shouldn't be surprising. This is one of these intuitive, counterintuitive things that makes political science so utterly maddening. Presidential campaigns don't actually promise that promiscuously. They do try to align their promises with their expected winning electoral coalition. And if they win, then their expected winning electoral coalition has the power tools to try to make them make good on their promises. But that probably accounts for about 25% of our foreign policy that's not sensible.
Yep.
That we only discount 75% of the promises and not 50.
Yeah. The worst decisions in my 4.5 years in the Bush NSC were almost always the result of anything but Clinton politics that found their way into the policy process. Almost never ended well.
Yeah.
That was a great office, by the way, Dianne Feinstein. She was interested in Asia, friends with Jiang Zemin. My brother Matt, Marine, seconded to DIFI. That's sort of an interesting cultural mix. As you'll recall, Holly Morrow, who came to work for me at the NSC, really top Southeast Asia.
I know, you stole her from us.
Yes, great office. Thank you. Thank you for taking my brother away, and thank you for giving me Holly. Your career is super interesting because you went from defense to the Senate and then back in at AID. And I know, talking to you at events at Indo-PACOM and so forth, that you understood why development was important, and coming out of DOD, how maddening it was applying that to the national interest. So what are some of the things that you took away from your DOD experience working in development in terms of the strategic effects you get out of development?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. And one of the reasons why I was interested in working for USAID when the opportunity presented itself was because like USAID and the Department of Defense, even though they are very, very different cultures and very different organizations, are both operational, right? They're both in the field looking to create real effects in the real world to move our national security forward. And so that piece of it and the ability to apply some of what I had learned at the Department of Defense about how to translate theory and strategy to policy to operations, I wanted to be able to take with me to USAID. And then the other piece of it and the attractiveness of the job was, from my perspective, a couple of years ago, but also now in 2025, when I think about where we really need to be putting points on the board in the Indo-Pacific as we think about this new era of great power, strategic competition, and what our friends in Beijing is up to, it's not so much on the military security side, although God knows we do have serious challenges that we need to meet there. Not so much on the diplomatic side, although again, there are gaps and challenges that the State Department has to deal with. But on the development, the foreign assistance, and the humanitarian assistance side, where we are able to forge genuine partnerships with our friends in the Indo-Pacific that allows us to move our foreign policy and national security interests and our values as a country forward. And being able to knit together, you talked about across the dime before for sort of my work, but being able to knit together a genuinely sort of 3D defense development diplomacy approach to foreign policy and national security so that we can synchronize and leverage to create the effects that we want to have, to build the relationships that we want to have, to be able to work on the development side, to support DOD and their posture moves, for example. That is, I think, incredibly interesting and exciting and important work that we have to do.
So my impression was that because of the urgency of strategic competition, the normal bureaucratic friction that you might have once had between state and AID and DOD receded, did not go on completely, but that the larger problem in doing what you described just now was that programming happens in legislation in Congress, which makes it hard. And maybe to some extent, the bureaucratic culture within USAID. I mean, a lot of senior people in AID did not go into the development business to compete in geopolitics. So what were the problems? You made a face just now indicating for our listeners that actually, no, the bureaucratic stuff is still there, but what made it hard to have strategic effects from development?
I don't want to disillusion you as to how seamless and smooth the interagency was over the past few years. I mean, I think it's fair to say that some of those frictions did recede or were smoothed away, but it was still awfully hard to coordinate across the U.S. government. And I mean, and you know this from when you were at the NSC. I mean, our NSC colleagues, occasionally overlords, did thankless work in trying to pull things together. But bureaucracies have their interests. Those don't go away because there's some newfangled policy or strategy that the White House is trying to push forward. So I think we got better, but it was far from perfect and far from easy. Congress, I actually, in my experience at USAID, I think Congress tried to be more helpful than not, including in trying to break down some of the barriers between bureaucracies that had traditionally existed. You know, I think the problem with Congress, and I offer this as somebody that loved my time with Senator Feinstein with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, venerates the institution even in its current dysfunctional state. The toolkit that you have available when you work up on the Hill is pretty much all tools that deliver blunt force trauma. And that can be fun when you're swinging the hammer, but it's not particularly useful from an executive branch perspective where you may be trying to do things that require a little bit more finesse a little bit more precision, a little bit more agility. And so even when friends on the Hill were trying to be helpful, oftentimes not as helpful as would have been ideal.
You know who has a better fusion of civil military strategies and harnessing of development assistance to military is our Chinese friends, which gives them a certain agility and focus in places like Sri Lanka, Solomon Islands, and so forth, but also makes them more repulsive and more challenging. So I think there is some strategic benefit in that healthy tension where the development assistance community, people in the country who are on the receiving side, generally they believe that it's a genuine interest in their economic development, that it's not predatory. So there are advantages in this. What are some of the accomplishments, though? Where did you have what we would call strategic effects through some development assistance programs in Asia?
I'll start by saying that I agree. The transactional, self-interested, instrumental approach that Beijing takes, it does allow them to pursue their interests at times in ways that at least superficially and in the short term, it can be more effective. But that is a very different model than we have, or at least have had up until recently, of meeting our partners where they are and working with them on their own terms with the confidence that the model that we are seeking to develop with them over time is going to help create the sort of world that is congruent with American interests and values. And the factory showroom for that, and then I'll get around to talking about some of the stuff that we worked on recently, right, is the Republic of Korea, right? 50, 60 years ago, rates of poverty in South Korea were akin to what they are now in sub-Saharan Africa, right? We, USAID, Peace Corps, other elements of the U.S. foreign assistance and development game went in a supportive way to help our Korean friends, right, with their own model, their own development trajectory, right? And today we have in the Republic of Korea a partner that is world-class, or has a world-class economy and is able to work with us in a number of critical areas of emergent tech, a military that is a critical security partner on PEN and in the region more broadly, a diplomatic partner at the United Nations and elsewhere, and frankly, the single greatest contributor to my Netflix queue. That's what successful development looks like, right? And that's what the United States, when we do development right, can bring to the game. In the past couple of years, I think we really paid a lot of attention to partners and allies like the Philippines, where USAID State and the Department of Defense worked very, very closely to align our defense and posture work with our development work and the economic growth that we were looking to drive in the Philippines so that we could demonstrate to the Filipino people the broader benefits of partnership with the United States and create the sort of deep and long-lasting political sustainability that's necessary for our alliance. You and I are old enough to remember when we got booted out of Clark and Subic, right? And just what?
Not you and me personally.
No. I've read about it.
Just to clarify, yeah. We were not personally kicked out. U.S. military, yeah.
Right. And what a strategic blow that was for the United States. I mean, we were able to bounce back, but it took an awful lot of time, effort, energy, and a lot of resources, right? So creating that more sustainable pathway forward in the Philippines. Likewise, a lot of work in the past couple of years in PNG and Papua New Guinea and Palau and with our COFA partners, the Compact Free Association partners, to be able to demonstrate what the United States brings to the game for the Pacific Island, for their development interests, for their climate and environmental interests, so that we could, not that we were doing it in a purely transactional way, but so that we could then make the broader arguments for why we were the partner of choice, or should be the partner of choice, across the entire spectrum of foreign policy, economic engagement, and national security. I think we made some real progress. In Southeast Asia, we were working with Vietnam, with Laos, with Cambodia, with Thailand to build a Mekong region-wide energy grid. And Singapore was also engaged because of their future energy needs, right? To be able to help them with development in Southeast Asia. I can sort of go
and that
go
was
on
strategically
and
important because the lower Mekong was vulnerable to Chinese, damming and hydroelectric and hydrographic interference, but also because creating those synergies across Southeast Asia laterally from east to west was a counterweight to China's attempt to create a north-south dependency in infrastructure. So these are things that directly impact geopolitics. During the Obama administration, when you were in the Pentagon and the much vaunted pivot, USAID funding on Asia didn't go up at all. And neither did the State Department, and DOD bumped up a bit. But in the USAID case, a lot of it was Afghanistan, of course, but a lot of it was a development philosophy that's common in all the DAC, all the leading donor countries, that human security and basic needs has to have weight. And Asia's relatively rich compared to sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. How did you find that debate? Was Asia is strategically more important, but in terms of human security, arguably parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Bangladesh should be at the top of the queue. So how did you deal with the human security Asia versus other regions problem as the Asia guy at USAID?
This was a real challenge at USAID, where the Asia Bureau there encompasses what for state is both South Central Asia and East Asia and Pacific. Because in the EAP part of my portfolio, East Asia Pacific, we had strong, capable development partners in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan, in Australia, who had resources and capacity that we could help bring to bear. And the United States was able to play a really critical role to catalyze and to mobilize and direct. And we were really making some real progress, particularly in the trilateral U.S., Japan, Korea space in the development partnership over the past several years. There are natural disasters that strike in the East Asia Pacific part of the Asia Bureau that obviously require a lot of concerted attention and resources, and where there are, in addition to meeting the human needs, where there are real diplomatic and geopolitical imperatives as well. I mean, you recall all of the work that we did in Indonesia after the tsunami in 2005 that really got us back in the game in Jakarta, considering the way in which, following the invasion of Iraq, perspectives on the United States had nosedived in Indonesia. And then we stepped up in tsunami relief and completely changed the way in which...
And I have to say, I was at the White House at the time and on point for a lot of our response. But the capabilities, the capacity of AID to formulate an integrated disaster response, obviously you needed Defense Department, then PACOM assets to get stuff there and to provide all the logistical support. But the ability of AID, frankly, the individual expertise was really quite impressive.
Yeah. No, I mean, it gets back to that point that I made at the beginning about like one of the things that attracted me to AID is, as with the Department of Defense, it's about operations in the field, right? And AID doesn't do plans, contingency plans in the way in which the Department of Defense does, but they did have real depth of expertise in that sort of planning for how to respond to a natural disaster, how to respond to tsunami, earthquake, volcano, all of those events that are critical to be able to engage on.
The other part of the toolkit we haven't talked about is the governance and democracy portfolio, which I've talked about on this podcast a lot. I think it's important when you're in a strategic competition where the other side will use poor governance, weak accountability in civil society, poor parliamentary procedures to engage in elite capture and buy their way into getting a military port in Hambantota in Sri Lanka or Solomons or wherever. You need a strategy to deal with that. But the challenge, of course, with governance and democracy is it's a long game. You don't normally get quick results like you do with disaster response. How did you find that worked? My impression is DOD, at least Indo-PACOM, got that. They really got it. But how did you find that aspect, that tool work?
Yeah, I mean, Indo-PACOM definitely got it and gets it. You're entirely right. I mean, we would have lots of conversations and discussions with development partners about how all of the habits of successful societies, free press, democracy, anti-corruption, vibrant civil society, that all of those are critical enablers for sustainable development. And if you don't have those, you can goose your GDP at any one point in time by, dropping a bridge on somebody's head. But that's not really going to lead to sustainable development. The complete toolkit that we bring to the game of good governance, right, that is what unleashes real economic growth and drives real growth and development. But for political leaders who are looking at their next election or looking at being able to deliver, even if they're in systems that don't have elections, like to be able to deliver, aren't necessarily thinking 5, 10, 15 years ahead. They're thinking about I got to build this soccer stadium next year because that's going to translate into votes. And we are at a disadvantage in that sort of game.
With leaders who are trying to buy their way to power, but not with citizens necessarily.
No.
And yeah, that's our long-term advantage. All right, then my next question was going to be, what have we lost by dismantling USAID? And by implication, you have just depressingly answered that for us. I can tell you that in discussions with senior officials in Tokyo and in Canberra in particular, they are deeply worried about the strategic implications of this retreat and this vacuum, and can give very specific examples of where Chinese ambassadors have rushed in to say, we'll do that project. You had a civil society project. We'll give you a Confucius Institute or other ways to learn about the civilizational development. What is a global civilization initiative? Rushing in with mixed success, but definitely worrying. On the board of Radio Free Asia, the Chinese media is chortling at the retreat of American-supported media in Tibet, Xinjiang, and so forth. So there's lots and lots of examples. But what, in the most immediate sense, in the next year or two, worries you the most about the vacuum we've created?
In a very simple way, right? If we want to be an alternative, if we want to be the partner of choice, then we have to show up and be an alternative. You can't very well tell people that, no, sorry, no cell phones, no cell service, no roads, no medicine, that's not going to work. By and large, my experience, I don't know about yours, our friends, our partners, even a lot of our not so much friends and partners in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, they are eyes open about Beijing. But if we're not showing up, and Beijing is, that doesn't leave them much of a choice. You talked about RFA. I know in Thailand, Xinhua came in to offer free content when VOA pulled out.
The Xinhua and the Chinese are providing content where VOA
Right.
and RFA used to.
Yeah.
So it's pretty black and white that we've lost. So now in large parts of Southeast Asia, content where they got half American, half Chinese is now all Chinese.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not expensive. It's really quite shocking.
And that has real corrosive effects over time.
I don't know that Australia or Japan will fill in that NED, National Endowment for Democracy, RFA, Voice of America piece. That's not what they've done historically. But DFAT, the Australians in their new aid strategy, are really focusing on the Philippines, the Pacific Island. They're trying to plug gaps in some of the most geopolitically pivotal parts of Asia where the United States, have stepped back. I think Japan's trying to do the same. Korea, with a new president, it's very much up in the air. Our allies' development capabilities. What's your expectation for how much they can hold this up in the wake of our retreat?
I'd say one other set of allies and partners to flag is our European friends. You talked about how Japan, Australia might not step into the NED gap, but some of our European friends, particularly the Nordics, right, they have interests in that sort of work. So there are folks with capacity if we can bring it to bear. I think the challenge right now is, right, this isn't just a question of who has money in their budget or who has technical capacity and skills that can be brought to bear. It's a question of leadership. I was never a huge fan of the indispensable nation, bumper sticker.
Yeah.
But there is something to be said that when the United States is not there, convening, mobilizing, catalyzing, things don't happen. That's actually the part that I'm most concerned about. We clearly need to do a much better job of recognizing, and whether this is in development space or on the defense security side either, that this is a team sport that we're playing for the balance of the 21st century, and we need to be much more tightly coordinated with allies and partners, feeding the ball around to the folks that have relative advantage and capability, right? There are things that we do really, really well as a nation. There are things we do less well. where the Japanese, right, who have quality infrastructure, for example, right, they do that better than we do in the development space. Without U.S. leadership,
Yep.
that coordination just doesn't happen, even if the capacity is sitting in Tokyo or in Canberra or in Brussels.
Yeah, and I can see that in Australia. The Japan-Australia relationship is going gangbusters, but there is a catalytic piece the U.S. does that's important. You mentioned infrastructure. Development Finance Corporation has not been cast aside like USAID, as I understand it. So that, at least on the infrastructure side, there's an American player in the game.
We talked about Congress before. DFC is up for reauthorization. And my hope is that Congress is able to play a constructive role in really supercharging DFC and helping to create a culture at DFC that has been somewhat lacking since its stand-up midway through the first Trump administration of risk-taking when it comes to investments in the development space, right? DFC needs to, from my perspective, think of itself less of a white shoe Wall Street investment firm and more as an instrument of U.S. grand strategy. And that means taking on board investments that might not otherwise pass the test if you're managing a pension fund, but that are important for national security purposes, right? You're not going to get your 12% a year return. You're going to get 8%, but there are non-pecuniary compensation that goes along with it. But that also requires an ecosystem around DFC, former USAID, Commerce, TDA, State Department, that's able to help do the de-risking, provide the technical expertise and support so that partners can develop bankable deals that they can then take to DFC for financing. DFC doesn't have that part of the operation in-house. They were relying and have relied on other parts of the U.S. government to be able to do that for them, which are now going or gone.
Yeah. So I don't know, and maybe it's not fair to ask you to predict, but sort of scenarios, expectations of what happens next. Australia folded USAID, their version of USAID, into DFAT. A lot of people in the development world thought it was outrageous. From my perspective, I think it's working pretty well. And in some ways, they've found a good balance between that human security, humanitarian purpose of aid and the national interest, which taxpayers deserve. I suppose there is a scenario you could say, look, folding USAID into State Department might actually have long-term benefits, but you don't hear that very often. What's your expectation of what happens next?
My big issue with what we've done over the past several months in defenestrating AID and then picking up some specs from the sidewalk to fold into the State Department is that we approached what might be an otherwise perfectly reasonable thing to do in a completely astrategic and backwards way. For 20 years, multiple administrations of both Democratic and Republican have considered and thought about folding USAID into the State Department or other moves to better align the development and foreign assistance work with our diplomacy. I am personally not at all, against that. When USAID was created in 1961, it was at a particular point in time for a particular purpose and in a particular world that no longer exists, right? If we were sitting down with a blank sheet of paper today to design a development assistance institution for the world that we have in 2025 and what we expect in 2035, probably wouldn't look a lot like USAID. So the idea of redesign, realignment, and even folding AID into state, I have no theological objections to that. I think the problem is that we went about it in a particularly thoughtless way, right? We didn't start with asking the question about, so what are the functions that we as a government need to have? What are the capacities that we need to be able to build to pursue our foreign policy and national security interests and our values? What's the technical expertise? What's the human capital that we need to have to do that? We simply slashed and burned and threw everything into the trash can when we recognized that, actually, these functions are important for our national security. We're going to have to rebuild that. And The further problem is we're going to have to rebuild it at a time when we have no margin for error, right? The urgency of the competition that we face with the PRC, Russia as well, right, is so pressing that people are not going to wait a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years for us to get their act together, right? The world will have moved on. I think when you talk to friends and colleagues at DFAT, I think they got it more right than wrong, but it also took them a decade.
That's true.
Right? There were missteps along the way. There were challenges with how to integrate two very, very different work cultures. We don't have a decade to get this right.
Lee Kuan Yew famously said Americans think that international affairs was like watching a video. I don't know if that metaphor works anymore for younger listeners, but basically, Americans think you can stop the video in Asia and go do something in the Middle East and then come back and the movie will be where you left it when you turn it on again. And that's just not how things work. If you could redesign our development assistance bureaucracy and strategy, maybe a new Congress, maybe a new administration, who knows, maybe even this administration decide we need this. What are some of the things you prioritize? You can't do it the way we designed it in 1961. You can't do everything we were doing. You have to prioritize certain issue sets and regions. What would your elevator pitch be for what this new development capability, bureaucracy, architecture looks like?
I guess I start with, and even though this is maybe the tougher pitch, with a lot of the governance work that we did and that we need to continue to do, because I think without that, none of the rest is sustainable.
You can have the best designs for urban planning or lower Mekong, but if the Chinese can roll in and bribe the leaders to cancel it, you lose.
Oh, and it's also the pathway for trade, not aid, for countries. Pick your bumper sticker, right? Pathway to self-sufficiency, right? Which is ultimately what we want for our partners. It's
and
not
relatively inexpensive compared to many development projects.
It's not about building a culture of dependency. It's about strong, independent partners. So that's
which, of course, is not just USAID. It's the NED. It's
there's a whole ecosystem.
Now defunct DRL.
Right. It's a whole ecosystem, all of which is under assault right now. But I think you've got to start with that as your fundamental building block. Other areas where there is sort of a big and immediate return on investment, the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief work. We talked about Indonesia briefly before. That is critical stuff. Life-saving work, whether it's in health or food assistance, right? Going back to President Reagan's "A Hungry Child Knows No Politics." The work that we did there, like with PEPFAR, for example, absolutely critical. And I'm hesitant to use this phrase, but in winning hearts and minds and in helping would-be partners to recognize that the United States, in fact, should be and would become their partner of choice. That is all work that is pennies, not even pennies, less, it's fraction of pennies on a dollar with outsized returns. And even if you want to be purely selfish about it, we want to stop diseases before they get to our shores. We want to address root causes that may lead to migration. I think there are plenty of reasons why we, as a country, want to do these things that have nothing to do with that sort of narrow set of arguments. But if you want to take it to the narrower set of arguments, that's there as well. And then lastly, right, the chapeau has to be sustainable economic development for free market, open systems of economic interchange. And there is a lot that can be done there where the model is not public sector driven development, but public-private partnerships that are, right, we talked about DFC before, that are teeing up the private sector for investment and success to be able to drive growth and development in the global South.
3 of those 4 priorities you just mentioned cannot be done by whatever replaces USAID alone. They require private sector for counter-corruption. They require NGOs. They require DOD for humanitarian relief. So I think one of the implications of what you're saying is people now studying to get a career in development at Georgetown or SAIS or Kennedy School. What I'm hearing you say is get out of your lane because the development world is not going to be the same. It's going to be a hybrid.
No. And I think this gets back to thinking about what does development look like in 2035 as opposed to in 1961 or 1991 or 2001. It is a different world that we now live in.
Michael Schiffer, one of the wise men of Washington on Asia. Really, really thoughtful. Really appreciate it. Good luck with everything. And we'll have you on again. See how we go. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. It was a pleasure.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.